The storm took my roof, but it brought me him. I had been in my grandfather's house for 2 months, scrubbing salt from the windows and sanding floors that creaked like old bones. The town called it a ruin, and maybe they were right. The walls smelled of damp wood and forgotten memories, and the porch sagged like a tired smile. But it was mine now, or maybe I was its. After the engagement ended, after Mark spat the word cold at me like it was a curse, I packed my bags and drove north, daring the house to break me first. The day the storm hit, the sky had been pale and quiet, the kind of gray that makes you think of gravestones. I was sanding the hallway floor, my hands raw and blistered, when thunder cracked so loud the walls shook. Rain came down in fists, pounding the roof, and then came the sound, a groan, a splintering scream. I looked up just as a section of the ceiling gave way, water roaring into the room like the sea had finally claimed what it was owed. I stood there holding a bucket under the waterfall, laughing, not because it was funny, but because it felt like the universe was laughing at me. That's when he knocked. 3 heavy strikes on the door, louder than the storm. I opened it to a man soaked to the skin, water streaming off his beard, and a toolbox in his hand. He didn't wait for an invitation. He stepped inside, tracking mud and rain across the floor I'd just sanded, and stared at the hole in the ceiling like it had personally insulted him. "Your roof's in my yard," he said, jerking his thumb toward the cliffs. "Half a mile down." His voice was rough, like he'd swallowed gravel and decided to keep it. I didn't know his name yet, didn't know he'd built half the boats in the harbor, or that he'd lost his father to the same sea that gnawed at the cliffs below us. All I knew was his hands, broad, scarred, steady as they nailed a tarpaulin over the gap. He worked in silence, his rope bracelet fraying at the edges. I made tea the way my grandfather taught me, black, with a spoon of honey. He didn't drink it. When he left, he took the broken shingles with him. He came back the next day, and the next. He didn't ask questions, didn't ask why I'd moved here, why I wore a ring on a chain under my shirt, why I sanded floors in the middle of a storm. He just fixed things, the rotting porch, the squeaky gate, the chimney that hadn't drawn smoke in a decade. I paid him in sourdough loaves, warm from the oven. He'd nod, take the bread, and leave it on the counter of his workshop down the road. I knew because I'd walk past sometimes, peeking through the window, watching him carve driftwood into curves, his black dog snoring at his feet. Once, the dog lifted its head and wagged its tail at me. He looked up, saw me, and for a second I thought he smiled. Just a little. One evening, I found him sitting on the edge of my broken dock, staring at the horizon. The sunset painted the waves gold, but his shoulders were tense, his jaw tight. I handed him a roll stuffed with spiced fish from the market. "You don't have to keep doing this," I said. He took the roll but didn't eat. "I'm not," he said. "I'm fixing my father's mistakes." I froze. Everyone knew the story. His father had built this dock years ago, poorly. A fisherman had fallen through a rotten plank during a storm, tangled in his nets, and drowned. Elias's voice was flat, like he'd rehearsed the words. He never apologized, just drank himself to death. The wind bit my cheeks. I sat beside him, our legs dangling above the churning water. "You're not him," I said. He turned then, his eyes the gray of storm clouds. "Neither are you," he replied. I didn't ask what he meant. Maybe he'd heard the rumors. The runaway bride, The woman too stubborn to let go of a corpse of a house. But in that moment, I felt seen, truly seen. Days turned into weeks. He taught me to carve wood. I taught him to knead dough. We didn't talk much, didn't need to. But I noticed things. The way he'd pause before entering a room, like he was waiting for permission. The way he'd trace the scars on his arms when he thought I wasn't looking. The way he'd leave coffee on my windowsill. Black, no sugar, the way I liked it. Once I found him in the garden at dawn, pulling weeds with his bare hands. "You don't have to do that," I said. He didn't look up. "I know." Then came the hurricane warning. The radio crackled with static, the voice urgent. "Evacuate or prepare for impact." I was nailing boards over the windows when his truck skidded into the driveway. "You're staying with me," he said, tossing my toolbox into the back. Not a question. His cottage was small, cluttered with maps and tools and the smell of pine resin. We played cards by candlelight, his dog wedged between us, snoring. The storm screamed outside, shaking the walls. When the power died, plunging us into darkness, his knee brushed mine. Neither of us moved away. During the eye of the hurricane, he stood abruptly. "Come on." We walked to the beach, the air eerily calm, the sky a sickly green. The waves had retreated, leaving shells and sea glass glinting in the half-light. He crouched, picking up a piece of glass. Green, worn smooth by decades of tides. Without a word, he pressed it into my palm and closed my fingers around it. His hand stayed there. When the storm returned, we didn't run. Rain lashed our faces, the wind tearing at our clothes. He leaned in, his forehead resting against mine, and whispered my name like it was a secret. "Mara." I kissed him, or he kissed me. It didn't matter. The sea roared, the world collapsed. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel alone. After that, things changed. He started leaving wildflowers in a chipped mug on the kitchen table. I'd find him in the garden at odd hours, mending fences I hadn't asked him to fix. We still didn't talk much, but the silence felt different, warmer. Then one night, my old phone buzzed in a drawer. Mark's name flashed on the screen. I answered without thinking. "You're really staying in that dump?" he sneered. "You'll never last." Elias walked in as I hung up. He saw the ring on the table, the one I'd finally taken off. His face closed like a door. "You're still tied to him," he said, voice cold. "It's not like that, isn't it?" He left, and for days the house felt emptier than ever. I found him in his workshop, sanding a boat hull with furious strokes. "I'm not her," I said. He froze. "Your father's ghost, my ex. They don't get to define us." His shoulders slumped. "I'm scared," he admitted, so quiet I almost didn't hear. "Of what?" "Of failing you, like he failed everyone." I took his hand, calloused and warm. "Then we'll fail together." We rebuilt the dock in spring. New wood, stronger nails. Beneath the first post, we buried his father's rope bracelet, the one Elias had worn for years, in a shard of sea glass. "To remember," he said. "To forgive," I replied. The dog barked at the gulls, and the sea for once was calm. Years later, when tourists asked how the old house survived, I'd point to the dock. "Stubbornness," I'd say. But he'd squeeze my hand and murmur, "Luck."